All right. It's exactly 3 minutes past. We're going to start. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this another dialogue with a conscious thought leader. And actually, on a regular base, every 6 to 8 weeks, I feel very lucky, privileged to announce somebody that I feel is earning the title of a conscious thought leader. And you know what? I'm saying this again with extremely big pleasure. And some of you may know Bob Anderson. If not yet, you certainly may have been exposed to his work. It's typically known as the Leadership Circle, which is a known tool, one of the most prominent tools to develop leaders in a very specific, conscious way. And we'll talk all about that. And I will invite you. You're free to leave on your camera. That's nice. We very specifically opt to have this conversation as a conversation. That's what's called a dialogue. You're free to opt out your camera and maybe switch it back on for the second half of the conversation, roughly, so you can orient yourself. We're going to get the conversation going in the second 30 minutes. As usual, those that know the format would invite questions. Until then, and I would like Claudia to manage and supervise that, keep your microphones closed. By mistake, you don't pay attention to it. Claudia may close it for you. And the question and answer will actually work through the chat. We have a regular standard Zoom layout, not a webinar. So use the chat and I'll pick up the questions, either invite you directly to ask them, or as they fit in the flow of the conversation with Bob, I'll just pick up on the question myself and maybe summarize 2 or 3 which go in a similar direction. With all that, let me be very quick introducing Bob. I'm trying to do a good job condensing it because he's such a rich work. Now, one of the things it says in the bio that you sent us, it's 35 years Bob has worked to integrate the best of leadership and theory and research, resulting in a comprehensive framework for developing leaders. And one thing that I'm going to refer to is indeed his model. It's a universal model of leadership. And we'll explore a bit of that. Now, I refer to this as a thought leadership because back then, there may have been other tools which refer to a 360, and they have some structure and logic to them. But in my humble perception, it is probably the most sophisticated model, and specifically as it links leadership capabilities to the adult development. And we'll talk more about that. Now, I refer to the tool, the Leadership Circle or Leadership Circle Profile. It's something called. You can read up on it. If you want to take a note, there's a book on mastering leadership. There's later a book they wrote on scaling leadership, building organizational capability. And one thing that I found interesting is he as well teaches, which may not be so surprising, at Notre Dame, at the Mendoza College of Business there. And if everybody can go on mute. I had an echo for a second. Now, the last piece of information, I'm going to start that as a question, because the last piece of information on your bio said, he's a true pioneer in the field of research, leadership development research. He spends the majority of his time researching, writing, consulting, and speaking around the world. And when I read he's spending the majority of his time, and I read before, for 35 years, that led me to the question very spontaneously. Now, since then, you're so dedicated, so focused, back 35 years ago, but ever again, what really attracted you to study leadership, to that intensity? Or let me ask for a twist of it. What was a starting question? What truth did you try to reveal by going on this quest back 35 years ago?
Well, it started when I was working in a manufacturing plant, making dog food.
Okay.
I was outside at night working inside a railroad car, sweeping out the car, and out of my mouth, completely out loud and unrehearsed, came, "I'm not becoming who I am."
Wow.
And long story short, I bred some Rilke, came into my life at that point, and the question, what must I be about in this life, emerged. What must I be about in order to live the life I came here to live and not someone else's life? And that question has been my guiding question, and it's led me into leadership. I've cared, uh, I have a very narrow focus of interest, and that's the deeper terrain of how we bring forth in each of us the beauty, the exquisite being that we already are. That's contained, not fully deployed.
Okay.
That's been my abiding passion, and it led me into working with leaders.
Okay. I have a follow-up question. Why specifically leaders versus flourishing, nurturing potential is obviously relevant for all human beings.
Yes, it is actually. There's a lot of answers to that question. I grew up in a leadership home,
Okay.
entrepreneurial family business, which is now a Fortune 500 business. In its heyday, in its years, it was way ahead on creative culture, employee rights. The unions couldn't infiltrate because it was completely, the employees didn't want it or need it. So I grew up in this milieu of that. And on the other side, leadership as well. So I kind of grew up in that and been naturally interested in it. I think it's a leverage point for change, leadership. Um, if you look at, especially anyone's a leader, but if you really look at the power of a senior leadership team, they have more impact on what happens in that organization than anybody else. So how can we have the greatest impact was kind of an abiding focus for me. The other thing, quite practically, is I had to pay the mortgage. So um, there are certain markets that are, can pay for it. And
True.
so it led me that
True.
direction.
True. True. Well, I want to lay some groundwork. I said that I'm guessing here. Some people know the leadership profile. Some people have read your book and studied your work. Some people know it actually intimately and very well, but some don't, or very loosely. So why don't we just set some groundwork and help people to understand better what we're going to dive into later. What is leadership according to Bob Anderson?
Well, that's a big question. Let me play with just a couple frames. One is leadership is the deployment of self into circumstances.
Deployment of self into
Deployment of
circumstances.
self in
Interesting.
any circumstance, your primary asset for influence is how you show up, who shows up. So the first level of leadership is self-leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Another one we got from our clients, one of our clients says, leaders bring the weather.
Mm-hmm.
So, when a leader walks in the room, a senior leader in particular, everybody's watching for what's the weather forecast for this meeting? And you get very quickly whether or not that leader is deploying him or herself in a way that's going to open up the conversation or close it down. And so leaders, the great ones, uh, have a practice of becoming very conscious of how they deploy themselves moment to moment in any circumstance, and whether or not that the presence they bring and the way they interact um, allows for what's trying to happen, or whether it actually um, closes the field of possibility thinking and creative thinking, or truth telling, or whatever it is that needs to happen in that meeting. And so, great leadership is conscious, and it's conscious about how it's showing up in every moment to allow that what's trying to happen to happen.
Okay. Let me ask the next easy question. You use the term conscious. We here are talking about conscious thought leaders. It's a conscious capitalism.
Yep.
And there's many practical definitions. I'm not looking for something esoteric or philosophical, but in practical terms, when you refer to conscious leadership or levels of consciousness, help the audience to understand better in a more
Yeah.
tangible, practical way what you refer to.
Well, we could go very deep into that question. I'll just put out a few thoughts. One is that the entire manifestation is a field, frequency field. You get into quantum physics, it's a cascading frequency field from lower to higher frequencies. And so there are spectrums within that we operate. Different people operate in different frequency fields, different time zones, if you will. And if you go into the spiritual traditions, these stages of development and ultimately into realization have been well described.
Mm-hmm.
And then in more current times, there's a field of adult development which is mapped out at least the more the psychological dimensions of that,
Mm-hmm.
earlier dimensions of the progression from, say, childhood into very mature adult awareness. And if you look at the work of Terry O'Fallon, she's taking that even a stage further, and she has a third tier in her model called metaware, which is when you start to break into the kind of terrain that the traditions have talked about, awareness of awareness itself. And so there is a trajectory, if you will, that humans go through if they develop. And so the profile is built right in the part of the trajectory where most adults are matriculating.
I tried. I don't know if it will visualize. So the guys online in the chat, actually, I copied that stages, the 5 stages, and exactly where the model locates most. Maybe you can quickly double click and just explain these different levels. I find them so relevant and so concrete in a certain way because I'm not surprised that you refer to spiritual practices. I'm not surprised that you prefer it refer to ancient traditions which connect to states of awareness that
Yep.
has a vibrational consequence. But referring to these 5 levels that you brought forward, I think using Keegan's model of
Yeah.
adult
There are
development.
many models. I mentioned Terry O'Fallon's. We did our research with Susan Cook-Gruder's model, which is the MAP assessment. Bill Torbert and Susan Cook-Gruder use the same assessment. So does Terry, but Terry's evolved a different model around it. But I first got on to stages of development in the late 90s, actually, before the profile. And the model that was developing got completely reconfigured when I came across his work.
Mm.
You notice there's 2 stages there called creative and reactive. I actually pulled that language in from the work of Robert Fritz. If you look at his work, he said there's 2 basic operating systems that people operate out of. One is moving toward creating what matters. Fritz is a creator, he's an artist, he's a composer. So he's not trying to solve a problem or get rid of something. He's actually trying to bring something, some inner gestalt into
Hmm.
being, painting, a piece of music, and so on. And so that is what we call creative, creating what matters most, versus reacting primarily from fear,
Okay.
solve the current problems. Now, when I came across Keegan's work, I realized that these 2 orientations were not just 2 options, but sequential. So you move out of adolescence, which on that model is egocentric. It's I am the world, the world revolves around me. If you've had adolescence, you kind of get that. Um, and then the first triumph of development is to move from that over toggling on my personal freedom to no, I do have to play by the rules. And there are certain values and mores and ways of operating that I need to adopt in order to get
Mm.
along. And so we then start to live out of our conditioning. And so that stage of development is an external locus of control, which is what the psychologists have described. You're defining me. The outside authorities more than I realize, telling me how I am to be and what makes me good and valuable and
That's still
worthwhile.
the reactive set.
That's a reactive structure. So I'm actually trying to make forward progress by not losing face, by not risking disapproval from the surrounding um, the people in my surround that actually define me. The next phase is uh, was put to me by a consultant that was working with me when I was in this transition. She said, "What would you do if you could?" Now I was stuck at the time and I was in blame. She said to me, the first thing she said was, "Well, you're not off. I've talked to your entire team. You're not offering any leadership." I said, "Yeah, I know about that. What else you find out?" She goes, "What do you mean you know about that?" And I said, "Well, how do you expect me to lead when I have no leadership? It's not my job, blah, 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 blah. I can't lead around here. My hands are tied." Well, that was my reactive voice, more complying in our,
Hmm.
I'm giving up power in order to be accepted and liked. I didn't see that then. But she then went after this big, like, I don't have any power, I can't lead. She said, "Well, what would you do if you could?" And that's the creative question. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail or you weren't going to get fired? What do you really care about that you want to bring into being? And out came another outpouring of all the stuff I wanted to do in my, not only at that organization, but in my life. And so therein is the tension, the
Hmm.
part which is caught in this case, an identity structure that's conditioned. I'm okay if you accept me. I'm okay if you like me, admire me. So
Hmm.
I look up and I say, "You hold the keys to my future. I want to consult you. I need to, and I can never fall from grace. I can't risk disapproval." And that was the catch 22. And I was getting a glimpse, and this is the core of reactivity. Right at the center is a belief or an assumption that my worth, my identity is made up by you. And then we adopt strategies to get that. I'm okay if you like me. I'm okay if I get the results. I'm okay if I'm perfect. I'm okay if I'm um, super brilliant, rational. Okay, safe. This makes me me.
I
This
think you're using
defines.
a term. I think you're using a term in that area that's just playing to not lose.
Yes, it's a play not to lose structure because it's driven by I have to or else.
Hmm.
Have to have you see me this way or else. I have to live up to these external standards or else. And
Let's talk about.
the or else is I'm nobody. Because if worth is on one side of the equation and being liked is on the other, or admired, not to be liked or admired is not to be. And that's
Let's speak more
terrifying.
about create the creative space. Um, and let me before you double click a little bit on it. In your assessment, help my memory. How many leaders, managers, people have taken? What is the empirical database that you refer on?
I don't know the number. I would guess we're at 50, 60,000 now, leaders who've gone through the assessment around the world.
Because my that for me was very important when I basically took the training and the certification. How empirically relevant
Yeah,
your model is.
yeah,
And later we're going to talk about connecting either reactive or creative leadership, which just seems to be the most distributed, the most dominant one, to
yeah.
effectiveness. What is roughly the percentage across these two stages, or maybe even integral, according to the 50, 60,000 samples? Where do
Yeah.
most people, before they're engaged in their work, where do most people end up? What is the
Well,
state of leadership today between reactive and creative and integral?
that depends on how you measure it. First of all, the leadership circle is not a measure of stage of development. It's built around that model, and the various reactive and creative are consistent with these stages of development. But you can't measure it through a 360. It's more complex than that.
Okay.
So if you look at the adult development literature that works on the nuances of how you're making meaning internally, it looks like about 75 to 80% of adults are um, somewhere at reactive or in transition from reactive to creative. So not quite fully configured at what we call creative, um, and earlier
Okay.
in their development. So about 20% of adults are in that creative to integral zone, and only about 5% fully configuring at a later stage of integral. And of course, the work that Terry's doing, which is post that, it's very, very, very few people are making meaning at that level of awareness.
How would you, if there is a simple description of an integral leader, and it occurred to me when I prepared this, is there an example, a living example? And I know none of them is only there. And I take it for granted, integral doesn't mean perfect.
Yeah.
But maybe you can allude a name or two that said, well, according to perception, they kind of get there. Reference names that people feel like, okay, I get it. That's what it's
Yeah.
referring to.
Some of them are easier as public figures. Say a Gandhi would be a unity informed, what we would call unity informed from higher
Okay.
leader. A Mandela, um, King, these would be really high level leaders. Um,
Are
we
there
are
any
working.
business
We
leaders?
are working with some leaders. Of the CEO of Syngenta, for example, we think is moving into that space,
Okay.
and the complexity that they're trying to manage. Think about, they're in a chemical company that doesn't, in a world that doesn't want chemicals, and they've repositioned their whole mission to renew the earth. And they're working deliberately with climate scientists, with Nature Conservancy, to say, how can we completely change our business model and bring science to renewing the soil, renewing the earth, and reforesting the earth, because we don't need so much land to plant on. And they don't know how to do that. Nobody does. And so, but they're declaring for it and holding that as the future that they
Hmm.
want, and letting that pull them into the innovation that's required to pull that off. And that's an example of an integral approach to leading an
Hmm.
organization or a consciously
Okay.
capitalistic business, right?
Yeah. 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 Now, one reason why I found your work so fascinating, I mentioned the empirical base, and then I want to relate the work, and I'm going to quote something if I get it more or less right, the relationship between level of consciousness and effectiveness.
Yeah.
And one of the summary statements I retained from my own training was conscious leaders are consistently more effective than unconscious leaders.
Yeah.
And when I read this, I found that so like also this sounds like a simple formula and that I want to double click. What made you conclude that? And then the big question that came up for me for sure was, so what are, in a nutshell, having seen, I'm sure, hundreds and thousands of people not only take the profile, but then develop, what do people need to do to elevate their level of consciousness? If that is the highway to
Yeah.
better management, to higher
Yeah.
effectiveness.
Well, the initial conclusion came from our research, where we did a measure of stage and correlated it with our profile, which has a measure of effectiveness on it. We found a very solid correlation between those two. In other words, how effectively you were rated by your group of peers, uh, as measured against or correlated against a self-assessment on stage development, Susan Cook-Gruder's MAP assessment. And we got very strong correlations. And if you look in our book, there were three groups. In the reactive group, the people that were rated on the stage of assessment as more reactive in her levels of development, they had an average effectiveness score of about 40th percentile, so 10 points below the worldwide norm. But
Hmm.
they were measured more in the creative zone on stage of development. They were in a 65% average effectiveness. And those that tested out at really late stage integral levels of awareness had an average effectiveness in the 90th percentile.
Wow.
So, and that was a game-changing study, actually. We see the same thing in our assessment data, even though it's not a stage development data. When we did a study in scaling leadership, which was the focus of the book, the results were so astounding. We just said, okay, let's go out here and measure the top quartile of effective leaders. Just get a sample of those, the senior leaders, and get a sample of the bottom quartile. Well, let's read their written comments. And what do you do that really works and what gets in your way? And the descriptions couldn't have been more different. So we see that when people are evaluated as more effective, they're also more conscious. And the data suggests that the primary move is actually a move that Brian Hall talked about in his book Value Shift, which is a stage of development model. It's a move from instrumental skills to interpersonal capability.
Mm.
And that we saw in our data in spades. The most reactive and ineffective leaders led from their personal brilliance, their intellect, their knowledge, their industry, their competent, those and and creative leaders or effective leaders had those too. They were equally described as having those. But the next, what they got lots of comments on was their interpersonal capability, building teams, developing others, listening, and so on. And it was a stark difference. So the major move into creative leadership is the ability to balance this, the yin and yang of leadership, the capability with people with the capability with getting results. And deploying yourself into circumstances in a way that develops capability in others. That's why we called it scaling leadership, because the great leaders scale capacity and capability and are
Before we go
good.
there, before we go there to the scaling aspect, just for the audience, I have a quote that refers exactly what you talked to.
Yeah.
We were stunned how relational the best creative leaders are and how technical
Yep.
reactive leaders are. And I'm sending this quote via the chat because I had it in my notes, and why not share it so people can actually see the summary. I found that a very revealing statement. And maybe to make it plain, using that relational dimension, which I know is one axis of the leadership circle, both in the creative space as well as in the reactive space, maybe you can use a simple example of relational traits of a creative leader versus relational traits, because of course they have them, of reactive leaders. Just to make it clear, they're both relational, but the place from which they act on is different.
Yeah. Well, if you look at that data, when you sorted the most, the researchers sorted into themes, right? And then we rank ordered the top 10 most described capabilities of creative leaders. 6 of the top 10 were relational. Teams, people, listening, followed by presence and vision and authenticity. So and vision, presence, authenticity,
Hmm.
passion. Their passion was interesting. They were passionate, but in service of mission, whereas the reactive leaders were driven in service of their own ambition. And there was only um, one theme on relationship that hit the high reactive list, and it was very low. It was like 20% of the comments were there. So versus 80. So it was kind of an 80-20 split.
Hmm.
So they literally were leading from their own personal technical brilliance versus how do I develop this team, this group of people to really perform together well.
Let me double click on one aspect before we go into the scaling. How to scale that, and what
Yeah.
would your insights mean to, and we have quite some people that lead companies, entrepreneurs. that have leadership development programs? How do you bring that into a company in terms of a program? But before we go there, you equally speak about yin and yang capabilities at some point in time. And I assume, you can correct me, that with yin and yang, you imply female and male traits or propensities in leaders. And the reason why I quote that, because this is what you mentioned, is at no point, at least to my lecture, you explicitly refer to female or male leadership styles. And then I really mean
Yeah.
female, woman and male.
Yeah.
Is that because you simply didn't observe it? Do you observe and believe there is a difference? I mean, not you
Yes.
can judge if it's good or bad, but is there a difference? And if
Yes.
yes, what
We
what
have posted some studies on um, women leaders versus men leaders.
so what
And
what would be a more female leadership traits or features versus male in your observation?
we alluded to this in, I think both of our books, really. Um, the data is pretty dramatic, actually, if you look at percentile data. So it's about, if I recall, it's about a 15 percentile difference, maybe a little more. Uh, in subsequent studies, we because what we did first for mastering leadership was not intended for that. So we went out then, and when we saw that, we went out and really studied it more directly, and it's written up on our site. Cindy Adams did it, and we find and the literature, corresponding literature, bears this out, that women leaders are generally more effective. And 15 percentile points are the difference between 40 and 55, 60, 42, 60, 58. I mean, that's a big shift, big difference. And it may be as high as 20 points in our second thing. And of course, it's more relational.
And
It's
that
more,
answers my next question to double click. Why is that? You think because they're so strong, and you mentioned that before. There's the quote I sent everybody, because creative leaders are so much stronger on relationship. So
you
you
know,
believe that's the key feature.
it's really important to get that in the highly, when we looked at highly reactive versus highly creative, they were both equally described as being technically capable.
Mm.
That made up all of the comments, or virtually all of the comments, on the reactive group. So that's what they were leading from. On the creative group, yes, they're very technically competent, blah, 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 in almost equal numbers. But then there was this volume of comments about their presence, their authenticity, their relational capability, and so on. And we find that women do more of that in their leadership and are therefore more effective.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that. And I'm not inviting you, I don't think it makes any sense to cut through the politics and power games, which undoubtedly exist in companies. The focus of my question will be, if you had to consult an entrepreneur, a CEO of a company with a critical mass who's looking at developing its leadership. And I guess in many, many companies, probably the most, I'm talking Western cultures, male leaders, number-wise, are still dominant. What what would you recommend, based on what you just said, to CEOs, owners, even investors, board members, to strengthen what apparently is a lack of female leadership, even in women? So there's less women in leadership positions. Is there an advice you would give how to use that power of female leadership and bring it forward more and
I mean, essentially
promote
that.
it in any fashion?
How do we develop any, say, a high potential group of leaders, right? So let's get deliberate about developing our leadership, and particularly paying attention to how do we make sure we have good diversity in our leadership. And I know that in the world today, that's becoming a word that's really not okay, but it
Yeah.
really is important. And so how do we become more diverse leadership organization is an important quality, an important movement for us, especially as we move into a more unitive awareness or consciousness. And I'm talking ethnic, gender, uh, diversity.
Let me be actually more specific, and the question may be looked at as a little political. I don't care. There's fractions, this happens in Germany, in my own mother country, where people will favor a quota because we believe you need to make room at a board level. This is at the board level. And it's a self-imposed ruling of German industry. Some people, for the reasons that we can imagine, are strictly against it. What is your take on promoting female leadership? And I know there's always this dual aspect of promoting female leadership traits in any leader versus creating more room and space for women to flourish. What is your take on that debate?
Well, the word that's coming is just yes. Yes, make room. Yes, balance it. It's been imbalanced for years, and we're doing horrible damage to the earth, to all life on this earth. And so we need a very different approach. We need a more conscious approach. So how do we, with without judgment, without making wrong, how do we really explore our hidden biases to see how we might actually be biased against an optimal balance of leadership in our organizations?
Mm.
I once consulted to a company. They wanted me to create a 360. This was back in the day when I had the thought we could create a IT that could, pull in different competencies and we could custom build. Got too complicated. I gave it up. But I had a leader come to me, or an HR director come to me and say, "Could you build us a competency model?" I said, "Sure. Tell me what." We got a new leader, a new CEO, and he wants to lead through leadership. He wants to transform the company through leadership. I said, "Well, give me his leadership model." So she sent it to me, and it was all yang. There wasn't a relational competency in the model. Nothing about teams, nothing about people, all tasks. And I just said, I'm not willing to build a model like this. It's not a balanced model.
And
So
therefore not an effective one.
completely not effective. So you can't get there from here. So it's an important conversation, and it's heartbreaking what's become of it, because it's an important integral conversation that we need to be in and paying very close attention to.
Thanks for that. Now we're turning to scaling, and I'm going to share another quote, which I found deeply interesting, and I'd like you to comment on it. And while I do this, folks, you're invited to participate and shoot your questions or comments. Haven't seen any yet, so I thought, why not invite you again? Leave it in the chat. The quote that I'm sharing right now in the chat is that you talk about individual effectiveness is necessary but insufficient for extraordinary business performance. Individual leadership effectiveness catalyzes collective effectiveness. Collective effectiveness carries the day, but the organization cannot perform at a level higher than the collective effectiveness of its leaders. So speak more to the collectiveness, to scaling conscious leadership. And specifically, how do the best companies do that?
Yeah. Well, one additional thought is that organizations will not perform at a higher level of performance than the consciousness of its leadership, because we create consciousness with effectiveness. So the collective effectiveness or the collective consciousness go hand in hand, we think. Well, in some ways, it's pretty obvious. You've been in a group, you've been in teams that really perform. You know what that's like. You know how it works. You've been in teams where they struggle to even have an honest conversation. And so the ability of a group to really lead together, to be aligned, to be focused on creating together something that really matters, the ability to have really honest conversations, difficult conversations, and do that in a great way. All of those dynamics determine whether or not that leadership team, whether it's a senior team or a team of that's leading a department or division in an organization, whether that team is functioning together to lead, to bring leadership to that organization and to develop leadership within that organization. So it's great for me to be effective. And the more effective I am, the more effective I can catalyze the development of a highly functioning team. But that's the charter as a leader. And so we think that organizational effectiveness is highly dependent on the collective effectiveness of its leadership organization.
What do great companies do, if you can speak without revealing the example, but I'd really be interested in some very concrete examples of companies that do that excellently. What do they do specifically?
Well, the first thing that happens, and I think it's a requirement, is the leader, the senior leader, gets clear that I'm the one that needs to change the most. Like, if we want to transform this organization, I need to transform. This organization is kind of the lengthened shadow of my leadership. So if something's not working, I'm responsible. And once they get that, Bill talks about it. I'm the project. I
Mm,
don't like to make myself a project so much,
yeah.
but and so that is essential. That catalyzes a lot. And the great leaders do that publicly. They do it out loud. They invite feedback. They talk about what they're working on and they get clear about what they need to do differently or what the team needs more of or less of from them in order to work more effectively. And they take that on. And our assessments help them get insight into that. And then they invite the team into that same process. So the team takes on its collective journey together. They do it openly, they do it vulnerably, they support each other's development. And that if that doesn't happen, you won't get a transformation in an organization. I once was asking Bill when I first met Bill. Bill had spent his career probably 30 years before my meeting him, or 25 years before my meeting him, doing
Mm.
large systemic transformation efforts, redesign transformation efforts in organizations. I said, Bill, have you ever seen an organization really transform its culture and its operations without the senior leadership team doing its work? And I watched him go back through 25, 30 years of history. And he goes, no, not one. So that is pivotal. Kurt Lewin said to work on the culture of the organization is to work on the culture of the senior team. There's a great poem. It's more written about the individual, but it's true of the team. It's a Kukai poem, a Zen 13th century, I think, Zen master. He says, the hand moves and the fire's whirling takes different shapes. The hand moves and the fire's whirling takes different shapes. All things change when we do. The first move blossoms into all others. Each of them is true. All things
Beautiful.
change when we do. this mysterious relationship between shifting how we operate and then the fires whirling takes different shapes. And then it's to scale that. It's like each leader becomes the CEO is the chief development officer, not HR. HR is an important support to this process. But if we delegate it to HR, it's game over. So I'm responsible for the development of this organization, its people and its culture, if I'm the senior leader. And I need help with that. So I have HR, I have my team. I got a lot to learn about how to do that well, and we're going to learn that together. That's first. And then everybody takes that on. So it scales team of teams into the organization. And we have whole processes that we've developed for helping that happen. Cohort, team-based cohort learning processes throughout the organization. And then of course you could look at the work of Bob Kagan in his book on I think it's an everyone culture, an everybody culture, everyone culture, and where he's been studying for years now how you create what he called a deliberately developmental organization.
Mhm.
Organizations actually are systematizing um, development, creating feedback processes and cultures and so on, where you're required to grow and supported in growing. So that's scaling leadership.
Thanks
And
for
it's
that.
right at the
Very.
heart of conscious capitalism. I mean, this is right at the heart of conscious leadership, conscious culture, and so on. So,
Let me double click on that. Um, and obviously, I'm not asking you or anybody in the audience to try to compare or fit one to the other, but something I wanted to test here, because those on the phone, on the video, they're going to know conscious capitalism. There's four pillars: conscious leadership, which to my rough estimate is so compatible and so fitting with what you refer to as leadership, integral leadership, creative leadership. Then they speak to purpose, conscious culture, and stakeholder integration. And the question I want to clarify, because that was my understanding, is that given your laser focus on leadership, I guess you must have seen that if leaders do develop their creative side and move on even to higher spheres, the whole topic that Raj observed, purpose matters,
right.
stakeholder integration matters, it will fall into place because that's what the leader, being a system thinker and being sensitive and reaching out, etc., will actually put in place. Is that a proper way that you look at it from a leadership perspective that will
Well,
put
and
these things into place?
yes, and the other thing that is a part of that is that the heart and soul of creative leadership is purpose. I'm about I'm about bringing into being what I care about or what we care about together. So it's purpose driven that gets translated then into what's the vision of the organization that will exist that doesn't exist now? What are we going to make happen to fulfill on that purpose? And that purposeful visionary is the number one dimension on our profile, most highly correlated to leadership effectiveness. The second most highly correlated is teamwork. So it's building an aligned team oriented on purpose and a compelling vision. So that's the heart of creative leadership. It's its beating heart. If you remember the question, I'm caught in, I don't know how to lead. I can't lead because I'm playing not to lose, but I have all these aspirations. They're just not
Mm.
bottled up in an externally focused um, identity. And the next question is, what would you do if you could? And out comes all this stuff that I want to be about. So when we move, we're not so encumbered by the old voices that say this is how you have to be in order to be okay. Those voices are there, but they're in the background more and more and more as we move on and we heal them, we work with them. And what emerges is a voice that says, here's what you're here to be about. Here's the life you came here to live. Now let's scale that if I'm a leader. How do we do something important. And then when it moves on to integral, it's the future that's pulling us. So we're not authoring a future. That's creative. We're being authored by a future that wants
Hmm.
to come through this organization or through me as a leader.
Yeah.
So we move from being authored by others to being self-authored to being authored by that which is larger that's trying to evolve
Yeah. Yeah.
through our organization.
Now, again, I'm not comparing, but that sounds totally in sync with Otto Schama, who
Yes,
would have used words, I know them pretty well, uh, sensing out the future that wants to emerge. That's
exactly.
exactly to your observation. Not
Exactly.
creating it, but sensing out what wants to emerge.
Yeah. For me, you know, for many years, I thought of myself in the David White language of stalking my longing. I'm
Talking
stalking
your
my
what?
longing. Stalking my longing,
Stop.
right? Like a
Okay.
hunter
Stalking your longing.
tracks a
Okay.
deer, you're longing, right? Stalking my longing. When later, when looking back, like Steve Jobs talked about, I look back over my life and I see how everything has woven itself in ways that are astonishing to create what's happened. I realize that longing's been stalking me. So there's this shift that happens from I'm authoring the future, and that's an important thing to step into. From I'm a victim of it, it's happening to me.
Hmm.
I'm the effect of all of these voices which say, here's how you have to be, into self-authorship, claiming that creative capacity to create is an important move. But then it moves on to become in service of, and then it's pulling you forward, not the other way
Beautiful.
around.
Now we have a question that is perfectly fitting. Thank you, Sylvia, for finally submitting a question. And I'm duly happy for it. One, because it speaks to what you just explained. And it will position, I'm not kidding, the next conversation with Bob Anderson sometime in the future, because his next phase of work will take him actually one step up. We've talked a lot about creative leadership, and Bob just referred a lot to the um, sensing out, I'm using Sharma wording, the future that wants to emerge and actually allowing it. And that is actually the integral leadership. And Sylvia's question goes in this direction. What's next for you? What is actually after mastering and scaling leadership? What is the next phase you're working on?
Yeah.
And the spoiler alert for everybody here is what Bob will be alluding to is something we will want to put in another dialogue somewhere in the future, because that stands on its own, taking it to yet another higher level.
Yeah. Well, let me just preface this with 5 years ago, I got asked to speak in Africa and a couple of different places, and so my wife and I went on a quasi vacation speaking tour in Africa for a few weeks. A wonderful time, but I decided, and this was early January,
Hmm.
um, 2020, just before COVID hit. I decided because I'd finished scaling leadership, and I was kind of like, okay, what's next? And I put to myself the question, if I only had 5 years to live, what wants to come through me?
Hmm.
What do I want to bring forth? What wants to come forth through me? And who do I want to need to become in order to bring that forth? That was the question. And I I was actually surprised by the answer, because as I thought about it or looked back over my life, I realized that I was happiest, most happy, most alive, joyful in powerful communities of transformation. I won't get into them, but one of them was the Barbara Brennan School of Healing for 4 years, energy work.
Okay.
And so I wrote myself another must. Remember what must I be about in this life
Yeah.
I went and I said, okay, I have a new must. I must convene, lead, be a part of communities of transformation. And so the next work for me is emergent now. 5 years later, we completed our first cohort, literally almost to the 5 year point, our first cohort of the Unity Academy, which is a full-on year-long deep dive into integral leadership informed by uh, the higher dimensions of the field, which would be described as unitive. Because as you start to move into the later stages, the ego starts to get thinned out and more porous or open to higher fields of information. And frankly, we're at a time where, as I mentioned with the Syngenta example, and I could mention others, where leaders have to learn to lead from the unknowing. Like there are no answers to the complexities, they're unfigureoutable, and yet we must. And so, how do we tap a larger field of intelligence? And I know that sounds a little woo, but if you look at some of the greats like Einstein, this is exactly what they talked about. And they were clear about it. We just don't have a mental model that has that make sense. We live in a separatist
Mm.
paradigm, reductionist, separatist, materialist, dead
Yeah.
universe. Einstein said, no, I think I get nothing. Then I sit in silence and ideas just swarm me.
Yeah.
So there's a relationship between being able to open to wider states of awareness, deeper states of awareness, and being informed by the future that's trying to come through.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for
that's
that.
one aspect of what we're trying to open up in this Unity Academy. So that's the work that I'll spend the rest of my life on.
Thanks. I do want to do justice. We just had a question coming in. I know we're on time, but maybe there's a simple answer. A great question from Pelle, who says, is the journey from reactive to creative a piece by piece process of transforming specific skill, or basically groups of skills by group of skill, or is it a more holistic process where you're raising the levels of consciousness to
It's not
become more
about,
creative?
there are skills to learn, but it's essentially not a skill movement. What we found when we did
Okay.
the scaling research was leaders don't run into their, the Peter principle. You're promoted to the highest level of incompetence, right?
Yeah.
Kind of a pessimistic view.
Yeah.
Um, we found no, it's not. They don't reach the limit of their competence. They reach the limit of their development. More often than not,
Mm.
they're bumping up against developmental limits, not capability limits, competency. And if I can just go back to my own story, one aspect of the work, I have to get clear on how I'm making up that it's too dangerous for me to stand in my own power, right? I have to come to grips with that, all that conditioning that says this is how you have to be. And then so that's not a skill. There's a capability development there to become more and more aware and how to transform some of that stuff. And then what would you do if you could? What matters? What do I really want this one wild and precious life to be about? And that's the move. You're oriented now on, oh, this is compelling. This lights me up. This
Mm.
resonates with my soul. And I'm also aware of how it scares the crap out of me, and I have to learn how to work with that part of myself in order to free up the energy to create. That's the developmental move from reactive to creative
Thanks.
primarily.
Thanks for that. We must stop, unfortunately. Thank God we decided spontaneously, I'm not kidding, folks, before the talk to actually have two dialogues, because the second part, exactly what Sylvia was asking for, the speaking to the unified field of intelligence, is so relevant and so big. Let's not butcher it and fit it into the same hour. I'm just going to give you a teaser because in that work, Bob and his team has identified 8 meta capabilities. I'm leaving you them in the chat as a teaser. You know where to find him. The leadership circle, those areas around that is called how to call that? The
Unity Academy.
Unity Academy. Thank you. The Unity Academy. So if you want to have a sneak preview, we certainly will have you back, Bob. It was a great pleasure. It was fantastic. Thank you a lot. And thanks for the audience for your attention to this point. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.